conservative,
Christian, mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Thank you for being with us. We have more Stacy on the Right. In fact, we have it right now. Welcoming into the show, Brandon Arnold. He is Executive Vice President at the National Taxpayers Union at NTU on Twitter. We'll be getting back to our conversation surrounding the ouster of the Speaker of the House after we chat here. And you can join us at 866-957-2874. Brandon, thanks for coming on the show tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so we have just an unbelievable, problem. You have the government scheduled to shut down, and then we were able to avert that with a temporary spending package that gives them another month and a half to figure out how to do their jobs.
It's pretty unbelievable that it had to come to this, because it's not a surprise. It's like being surprised when Christmas comes around on December 25th. We know that it happens every year. If you're shocked by it, then there's something wrong with you. But that is what happened with Congress, seemingly. It happens often. They come around to the end of the fiscal year, which is the end of September, the beginning of October, and they all of a sudden realize that they need to pass spending bills if they want the government to continue to operate and function. And then there's a mad dash to try to slap together legislation to fulfill that goal. And it's created in such haste, and it always contains a tremendous amount of waste and too much spending and not enough scrutiny. And it's a real shame that it comes to that. But that work needs to begin in the spring. It needs to start early, months and months of scrutinizing every line in the federal budget, finding places to trim, finding functions that don't need to take place, that are duplicative, and really provide that extreme level of scrutiny that taxpayers need.
So is it just a case of maybe these people no longer have these muscles available to them? Because you know how it is. You stop going to the gym for a while, you go back, you try to work out the way you did the last time you were there, you hurt yourself. You may injure yourself. Or at very minimum, you go home and you wake up the next day and you're so sore you can't move. And then you have to kind of slowly, basically not even crawl before you can run. You're dragging yourself along on your belly before you can get up onto your hands and knees. And before you know it, 6 weeks have gone by to try to gain back, where you were 6 months ago. I feel like they've had so many continuing resolutions and such a lack of muscular action on budgets, the very basic functions of that, which is this is their job, but they haven't been doing it. Is there anybody left there who actually knows what's supposed to happen right now?
That's a good question, and thank you for, first of all, reminding me I need to go back to the gym. I haven't been for a little while, but that's another matter altogether.
I'm speaking from experience over here. Let's not discuss it. It's terrible.
Life gets in the way, but no, I think that's part of it. And listen, let me say, there was a good faith effort this year, I think, by many on Capitol Hill to pass appropriations bills, and I'm specifically thinking of the House of Representatives. The Senate was a dumpster fire in this regard, but there was a legitimate effort. Kay Granger's the chair of the House Appropriations Committee. They were able to move most of the bills through the committee. They were imperfect, as all appropriations bills are, but there were actually a few in there that did make some significant cuts. And when we talk about the appropriations process, one thing that I really encourage people to think about is not just the levels of spending and not just the programs that it funds, but also what's called policy riders. And what Chairwoman Granger did this year that I really liked was inserted a number of policy riders to block things that the Biden administration was trying to do. So you can insert language in a spending bill that says we're going to give X amount of dollars to, say, the Department of Labor, but none of these funds can be used to fulfill this mission or to implement this rule. And they had a lot of really important riders there to block the crackdown on independent contractors, block rules that would have basically destroyed the franchise model that has supported so many small business owners for decades and decades. So all of these awful things that Biden was trying to do to the economy, if we can have a functioning appropriations process, we can defund these particular initiatives, get that into law, and really stop the Biden agenda. It's really the only tool that Congress realistically has to stop Biden's regulatory assault on small businesses, on the energy industry, and so forth.
Yeah. It's interesting because the House has so much power and they have so many different mechanisms by which they can rein in the executive branch. And the Republicans were actually elected to do that for that specific reason. Like, Americans want to see something robust from this House, and they seem like they're too weak to get it done. Now you have Speaker McCarthy being ousted, and there are others now queuing up to kind of take that role. He has someone who is actually quite close to him, his the Speaker pro tempore, so he's going to be there in the interim. But now you'll see a bunch of the kind of usual suspects, people who I think would have been better from the start, like Congressman Scalise. These are better options for us as voters, but we had to go through this big, long exercise of having Speaker McCarthy. And I honestly can say, because I sometimes I don't feel like we should place as much value on what history will say. I think he shot himself in the foot because he insisted on becoming the speaker when people really didn't want him. And now he's done, 10 months of a bad job, and that's what he's going to be remembered for, instead of maybe some of the other work that he possibly did before he took this on.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to unpack, and so much has taken place just in the past several hours here. But, here's what I think, Stacy, and we're not going to cut a nickel of federal spending if Republicans don't unify. So, we can pick apart what McCarthy did, and I agreed with some of the things he did. I disagreed with some of the things he did. I think that's probably the case for most observers as well as members of Congress. But at the end of the day, McCarthy's not the speaker anymore, and I don't know who it will be. I think Scalise, there's a strong possibility there. I think Jim Jordan could possibly throw his name in the ring. Tom Emmer, who's currently the majority whip. I think there's a few strong candidates. I like all of those individuals, and I think they all bring different strengths and weaknesses to the table. But Republicans, whether they're very, very conservative, moderate, middle of the road, whatever, they really need to unify, and they really need to figure out what the enemy is here and who their allies are. Because if we don't have unity within the Republican Party, we have absolutely zero chance of cutting a single nickel from the federal budget. If we don't start moving these spending bills, if we don't start acting with some degree of cohesion, then we're really in deep what.
So talk to me about what you think is actually driving the inability of Republicans to have cohesion, where the Democrats seem to have the ultimate amount of, like, they're always touching, they're always going in the same direction. Even when they're fighting, they're still accomplishing their legislative priorities. How can the Republicans be this divided when Joe Biden is the president? Like, that should be the ultimate unifier.
Yeah, I think, it's tough because I think different elements of the Republican Party have different problems associated with it. I think sometimes the moderates are too quick to just throw up their hands and give up. I think sometimes there's folks on the Hill that are just like, hey, this is business as usual, so this is what we're going to do, and they're not really willing to look at alternatives, to look at other ways that we can possibly attack the spending problem and attack the regulatory problem and other issues. And then I'll be honest, I think the right, the Freedom Caucus types have often overplayed their hand. I think they've overestimated exactly how much power the House has when you consider that bills also need to go through the Senate, where it's a much more liberal body, and bills ultimately need to be signed by the president, who's obviously very much on the left. So the House has a lot of authority. It needs to flex its muscles, and it needs to stand up to both the Senate and the president. But that doesn't mean that we can pass enormous cuts each and every time. There's going to have to be some level of compromise there. And I don't think there's enough willingness to make those compromises and make those incremental gains. We've got a $33 trillion debt right now. It's massive. We've got $2 trillion plus deficits this year, and as far as the eye can see on the horizon. We can't fix these problems with a single piece of legislation. We can't snap our fingers and kind of make it go away instantaneously. It's what's the best way to eat an elephant here? One bite at a time. We need to start taking bites, because right now we're arguing about what's the tastiest part of the elephant, and we're not doing anything to slow its growth. Yeah.
So that's I think that's the part that's most concerning. I was thinking about it, and I said on national television, there's no way any bank in America would allow me to behave in the way that our government behaves, borrowing incessantly, not actually tracking spending, losing billions of dollars in rounding errors, shipping off billions of dollars to a foreign country while leaving, the actual citizens of this country, on the hook, $700 here, $400 there, when they've suffered a disaster. I mean, there's so much wrong going on. And I agree with you that you don't have a ton of power if you don't have a president to sign your legislation into law. But the purpose of the American people giving the House to the Republicans was so Republicans could show the Democrats and show the American people the differences between the two thoughts and mechanisms of governing. Democrats want to spend us into oblivion. Republicans are supposed to want to rein in spending and bring order back to our fiscal house. So you have like a timeline of what to expect if there's a shutdown. Do you think that there's a shutdown likely now that this has gone on, and they're obviously they're going to elect a new speaker, and there's going to be hopefully a unifying of the Republicans? Do you think they'll avert the shutdown, or is that just inevitable at this point?
I wish I had more clarity into that. I thought that a shutdown was almost 100% likely prior to what took place on Saturday with the continuing resolution. I thought it was a done deal, as did most of the folks I talked to in Washington on and off the Hill. But going forward, I think next week is really going to be indicative there. Are Republicans going to be able to put this mess with McCarthy behind them, lick their wounds, break bread together, and appoint a new speaker that has the support of the entirety of the Republican conference? If that's the case, then I feel pretty good about averting a shutdown. And I think all the candidates we talked to, we can throw McHenry in the mix as well. He's the speaker pro tem right now from North Carolina. He's a guy I like a lot. I think he's done a good job of working with both conservatives and moderates across the conference. So any of the folks that we've mentioned here, I think would do a good job. The question is, do they have the support of the entirety of the conference? Until we can heal these fissures in the party, like I said earlier, we just don't have any chance of unifying. And I think you're right, what you said earlier, that the Americans elected Republicans to take over the House of Representatives so they could provide a contrast, so they could provide an alternate vision for what this country ought to look like. And that starts, I think, with the size and scope of government. But they haven't really done it. They haven't really passed bills. They haven't been able to unify and get out of their own way to say, here is the blueprint. Here is the budget that we see our nation ought to follow. And until they provide that vision, they look like a bunch of squabbling nincompoops. And who would give a bunch of squabbling nincompoops more power and more authority? I think the average voter says, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, and you know what's funny about this? Brandon, Newt Gingrich is still alive. It's not like he's not available. You know what I mean? Yeah. Newt Gingrich he did the contract with America, or contract for America. And Bill Clinton was still wildly powerful. I don't know if he was popular, but he was wildly powerful. And he was concerned about his legacy. So he sat down with Newt Gingrich, and they came up, he's like, what do you got? And Newt Gingrich says, well, I have a contract with America, and it'll rein in spending, and it will give you a booming economy. It'll kind of set the fiscal house in order. You'll be remembered for this as opposed to some of the other things that are far less interesting for you to be remembered for. And Clinton, because he saw something in it for himself, took the deal, and they did. They presided over a booming economy, and there were a lot of things that Clinton got credit for when all he did was show up to the table and say, what do you got? But that's how it is. When you're the executive, you can take credit for things that go well. You also get blamed for things that don't go well that maybe you had nothing to do with. That's the job. Why can't our Republicans of 2023 get together and say, you know what, your economy stinks. Next year's an election, and you want to turn the economy around before then. We don't want to help you, but we also know Americans are hurting. So here's what we've got. Why can't they do that?
Well, I mean, the first thing is we need to pick a speaker and unify around the speaker so that individual has a mandate to go into the Oval Office and negotiate with President Biden. And I think the other big difference between now and the 90s is that Clinton was a pragmatist. We can say plenty of negative things about Bill Clinton, of course, but he was very much a pragmatist, and certainly by today's Democratic standards, he was a moderate, if not a conservative, by today's standards. So, that's why we saw welfare reform that actually instituted work requirements, whereas Biden is allergic to work requirements in any kind of federal program. And, Biden has become an idealist. We can argue about why that's the case, whether that's his own doing or whether he's been led in that direction by his advisors, associates. Probably the latter, but you see, I think, most starkly in energy policy, where he's a complete idealist. He thinks that we can, again, flip a switch and all of a sudden all be magically driving EVs and have solar-powered houses and factories and so forth. That's a transition that, if it takes place at all, is going to take place over the course of decades, not instantaneously. So that's where that idealism really runs head on with the pragmatism and realism that we need from a president. We haven't gotten that from Biden, and it makes it really difficult to engage in negotiations. I still think there's hope. I try to be an optimist myself. I still think there's hope, but it makes it a heck of a lot more difficult when you're dealing with somebody who doesn't see the political pragmatism, the triangulation, of course, of James Carville and Bill Clinton that made Clinton very successful politically, and also helped to see some fairly conservative policies, balanced budgets, welfare reform, and other good policies come out of that administration.
Yep. You make excellent points about the difference in Bill Clinton and Joe Biden. Way back when, we would have said, yeah, Joe Biden is to the left of Clinton, but we wouldn't have called Biden a radical. But things are far different now. I mean, what a difference a few decades makes in between that presidency and this one, especially with him being a Democrat and, claiming to be an everyman who's from Scranton, although, a 10,000 square foot mansion doesn't sound everyman to me. But yeah, why pay attention to the details? So I had to say thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight and for sharing it's very interesting take. One more quick thing. I know you are also covering the return of college loan payments. I mentioned that earlier. What do people need to know? They're back, right? This is the month.
Yeah, absolutely. They're back. 3-year pause, both on the payments and on the interest accrual. So that is a big change, and that's going to take a bite out of a lot of working families' income. You're talking about $200, $300, sometimes considerably more, depending on where people went to school, how much it costs. So I think the big picture is that this is not going to have a huge impact on the economy at large, but it is going to have a big impact on a lot of American families. And while I do think the payments need to restart, I think it's the appropriate thing to do to get people repaying their loans. I do think Congress at the same time needs to be sympathetic to folks that are really dealing with a horrible economy when the cost of everything, housing, food, energy, you name it, has skyrocketed. Adding another expense to the family budget is going to be tricky, and we need to think about better tax policy, better trade policy, and we need to really address the higher education policy problem at the source, which is driving down the cost of college, rather than trying to paper over it by canceling people's loans after the fact.
Mm-hmm. I agree 100%. Well, thank you so much for the 2 articles and for spending time with us tonight live on the show. Really appreciate you, Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President at National Taxpayers Union. The website is ntu.org. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Stacy. You too.
All right. And we'll be back with more. We're going to be chatting with the best listeners in satellite radio about the speaker being removed. A lot of people have great things to say on both sides of the issue. 866-957-2874.
Conservative, Christian, mother, wife, Air Force veteran, gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Thank you for being with us. We have more Stacy on the Right. In fact, we have it right now.